I'd like to take this moment just to do a little introduction to our presenter tonight, Dr. Cynthia Ganote. I don't think I would know her unless she actually showed up a couple years ago to our Lasallian Women's Retreat. At the last second, she was able to join us, and I'm so grateful. I had no ideas of her background, even during the retreat, till just recently as I saw your Facebook posts. So I am very grateful that she is able to join us tonight, and she is actually doing this gratis. So thank you for your generosity, Cynthia. You're beautiful. She comes to us from Louisville, Kentucky, where she is the Assistant Dean for Diversity and Community Engagement at the University of Louisville. She's also a faculty member in the Department of Sociology. Much of her work and her research focuses on raising people's consciousness and awareness of microaggression and meeting them with communication tools called micro-resistance. She serves as a national consultant on diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education. We are so blessed to have her, and I'm so blessed to call her friend. Thank you, Dr. Ganote, for being with us this evening. Yay, 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 yay.
Shall I take this now?
You got it, lady.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Lori. I first want to say I am so honored to have this opportunity. I have been, of course, I'm here in Louisville, and I know that, of course, you all may be in a lot of different places, but many, I assume, are in the Chicago area at the moment. And I want to thank my friend Emily Vogel for getting me to the women's retreat at LaSalle Manor, where I was able to commune with so many incredible women, meet Lori and become friends with Lori. And that's my entree into this. So I'm just incredibly honored to be here. And I really would love to, as part of this, just say, I love all of Christy's beautiful community guidelines that she gave. And if there's anything else that you think, oh, we need to add something, we need to add to the guidelines, please raise your hand, let us know about that, because we really want this to be able to be a space where I'm going to give a little bit of information just for background, and then we're really going to go into the deep dialogue in groups. So I just want everyone to be able to feel like we have a space here where we can open up and talk about where we are with these issues and really share from a deep place with each other. One of the things that I really want to ask us is, and this is what I do as a person who's been teaching these concepts of systemic racism and patriarchy and heterosexism and class exploitation in the sociology classroom for a long time. One of the things I want to ask is for all of us to just admit that we each are coming to this work from a truly different places. Some of us will have had occasion to actually have thought about a lot of the issues related to systemic racism for a long time. Some of us may be newer to the work, and I think we'll have everybody in between. So I made some assumptions that let's just start with some definitions, and let's go with just calling everybody to be exactly where you are. So I really am calling all of us to an open heart in doing this work, and here's hoping that we can all move forward with even more open hearts as we move forward after this workshop as well. I'm a white woman who teaches this work. I have new things to learn all the time. And so please don't think, that I or any person has all the answers. I certainly, as a white woman who does anti-racist work, have to stay deeply, deeply in dialogue with my colleagues, friends, community members, family members of color, and stay in really deep dialogue about how systems of oppression like systemic racism are affecting all of us. Every single one of us is welcome here. It's incredible. If you, in your small group, need to say, I really am just learning. I didn't know what I didn't know. I'm here. Absolutely welcome. There are a million reasons to look for each of us to try to move forward on our journeys towards anti-racism. One is, I know that of course not everyone here is in higher ed, but I also understand from the guest list that there are a number of folks who are in higher ed. Here's but one example, and this is on the micro level. One of the ways in which systemic racism shows up is in small everyday interactions called microaggressions. Of course, there are many other forms of racism that are far more macro or big, large level. But even the microaggressions that might happen in our spaces, here's just but one finding. A guy named Daryl Wing Su, who does a lot of incredible microaggressions research in higher ed, he's at Columbia Teachers College. He and his researchers found out that microaggressions negatively impact students' sense of academic achievement and feelings of inclusion. And I know so many folks here, whether we're in higher ed or in schools or in communities or in retreat centers or in or spiritual directors in different spaces, I know how much each of us does not want this, does not want different folks feeling like they don't belong in our spaces, or that their voices or their bodies aren't welcome. So that is literally one of many, many different reasons for all of us to engage in this work. So one of the ideas here is, and for some of you, this may be very, very much something you already know about, and for others, it may be newer. So one of the hard things about teaching about racism in the US is we have this idea that there is one bad apple. I literally hear that phrase a lot lately. I've heard it all throughout my career, but there's such a sense of American individualism, that the idea that, oh, well, I individually am either racist or not racist, and all these other people, I mean, if you just get those who are in white supremacist groups or anyone who's performing overt, horrific racism that almost anyone could agree that's a racist act, we could just get that one bad apple taken care of, then all the rest of us are gray. Well, as a sociologist, I think a lot about societal, both cultures and structures, and how racism and things like that are built into it. So I'm always working against the one bad apple framework, and instead want to start with a framework that is by Beverly Daniel Tatum, who wrote a book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? This is a powerful, incredible book. The second edition has so much front matter about how voter suppression has started again in the US since 2013, all kinds of incredible, timely material, and also a lot of really classic ways to think about racism and how to talk to kids about racism. So it's a great book. Tatum says racism is prejudice plus power. So a lot of people will say, you know, oh, that's reverse racism, or this is those folks are racist, and they'll say it about communities of color. For sociologists, actually, anyone can hold prejudice. Anyone. You mean anyone of any different identity might hold prejudice, and prejudice is just a preconceived notion about somebody because of something about them. Maybe it's because the group they're in, maybe it's because the color of their skin, maybe it's their gender, maybe it's their gender performance, or meaning how they express, masculinity, femininity, or gender nonconformity. So prejudice can literally be about almost anything. Tatum and a lot of others say it isn't racism unless you have the group power behind you. So for Tatum, racism is prejudice plus the power of a group. So in this category, white, being of a white identity, a white person could be racist, where someone from a person of color, a Black person, an Indigenous person, or Native person, a Latinx person would be considered, could have prejudice around those in other groups. But in this case, Tatum would not call them racist, or would not call that a racist act. So that's one framework. So what is systemic racism? You may hear, I imagine more recently in the broader media, you will hear the term systemic racism. You will also hear, often interchangeably, the term institutional racism, sometimes even structural racism. So I'm using all three of those interchangeably here. As an academic, different people have different theories and nuances, but this is, I hope, a good general definition. Systemic racism is a form of racism that is embedded as normal practice within a society, within an organization, built into our institutions. So when you talk about systemic racism, as a sociologist, it really takes it away from you're racist and you're not. That isn't how I go about talking about racism. I like to talk about how are our institutions actually embedded with what's considered as normal practice in ways that actually give the most highly valued resources, the money, the time, the prestige, the power, the having a roof over your head, the being able to drink clean water, being able to have quality health care. How are those kinds of things built into a society where there's greater access to those highly valued resources given to some, and disadvantage from those highly valued resources given to others? These are difficult things to see without having had your eyes trained to look at them that way. So I always ask my sociology students, let's put on our structural lenses. Again, not about, am I racist? Oh my God, are you racist? Are we? It's not about pointing racism fingers, but instead going, wow, where do we as a society, or where do we as an institution, or where do we as a group, an organization of folks who work together, are there any practices that we have where we might, unbeknownst to ourselves, be privileging some groups and holding disadvantage for others? As an example here, systemic racism can certainly lead to issues such as discrimination in the criminal justice system, discrimination in employment, housing, healthcare, political power and access to power, in education, who gets the access to a quality education with teachers and faculty who are deeply caring, and who is limited from those kinds of opportunities. So that's systemic racism. Now, when you have something like systemic racism, you also have, on the flip side, something called white privilege. And I always talk to folks about, you can't have a group that's deeply kept away from the most highly valued resources in a society, group or groups. And I'm grouping here people of color. But in really specific terms right now, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is certainly asking us, let's look really specifically the ways in which Black lives are not valued in our society. In which ways are Black lives really, in what ways are Black bodies murdered, battered, beaten, held from the most valuable types of healthcare, education, clean water, and all those kinds of things. So when a group is held from these assets, well, there's a lot more to go around for another group. The flip side of that coin then is something that a woman named Peggy McIntosh calls white privilege. What is white privilege? It's really just an invisible knapsack. Now, she wrote this in 1989, and she was writing from Wellesley College in the Northeast. And so a knapsack is what we would think of as a backpack. So if you think of an invisible backpack or an invisible package, an invisible bag, I don't know how you'd like to think of it, of unearned assets. So I'll talk through that in just a moment. Unearned assets, which the holder of the backpack is designed not to see and not to be aware of. Now that's tricky, right? So when we think of something like white privilege, when we talk about unearned assets, what might we be talking about? We might be talking about things like Peggy McIntosh, her metaphor is about having in your backpack a get out of jail free card, an extra wad of cash, a credit card with no limit, a GPS, a live stream to what's happening behind the scenes so you have insider knowledge. And so when Peggy McIntosh in this classic 1989 article talks about how she concretely gets forms of white privilege, she has this kind of list of things that she concretely made herself write down. And she said things like, she, as a white female colleague, could walk into meetings and whatever she said, whatever mood she was in, if she cut somebody off or whatever, people would not attribute that to her race, but instead to her Peggy. Oh, Peggy is this. Whereas, of course, we know that a number of folks of color, Black folks, and folks in a number of other groups are not afforded that privilege. They're often felt to be representing every one of their race and often asked in classrooms, so-and-so, would you speak for, all folks of your group? I'm never asked, what do all white people think? It's very clear to folks that, wow, white people think a lot of different things, have a lot of different perspectives, backgrounds, experiences, and there are all kinds of intersections between our race and then our social class, our gender and gender identity, our sexualities and age, geographic region, all these different things. So white privilege then wants you to think about the kinds of ways in which, if you are white, ways in which white privilege shows up in your own life. If you are not white, ways in which you see white privilege as it appears in the society. I will name a few things for myself just in case it helps raise people's awareness. When I, a white woman, walk into almost anywhere, if I walk like I act like I know where I'm going, people do not call the police on me. They just don't. I've not had the police called on me. Have I walked into spaces where I'm like, I want to get closer to the action. I want to get closer to the stage. I want to talk to this person. Yes. Am I usually allowed to go right through? Yes, absolutely. I know this is not true for my Black women and Black male friends. So that's a white privilege that I hold. I bought a house in January and moved in February just this year. I enjoy the privilege that moving in here, I assume most people would feel either favorably or neutral, just absolutely kind of neutral about my moving into a neighborhood. I do not have to perform constantly in my little tech flub earlier. I don't assume that you'll go, white women cannot do tech. You might go, wow, Cynthia could really brush up on her tech skills. She really needed Brad's help there. Everybody's very kind here. You probably are not thinking that, but if you are, I get to own that instead of going, wow, I represented all folks of my race in such a way. So those are just some examples, and I would ask you to think about those in your own life. When people talk about, I do a lot of workshops, Lori, alluded to this earlier, I do a lot of workshops on something called microaggressions, and it's the small commonplace ways in which folks exchange or give out hurtful or insulting kinds of verbal or nonverbal or environmental cues about whether other folks are welcome there or not, and they may be intentional or quite unintentional. So I give a lot of workshops on how can we raise our awareness of microaggressions and how can we address them. A lot of people say whenever we see macro level racism or microaggressions around systemic racism, do we have to address it? I would never say to you, you have to address it every time. I could never know your circumstances. I could never know the context. I could never know, is it your boss who's constantly throwing out the microaggressions? I could never know, and I would never tell you, do it every single time. But I will give a general principle that everything speaks. So our silence speaks. If we end up having that horrible gut feeling, I don't know about how your all's intuition or gut feeling or those kinds of things show up in your body, but for me, it's this feeling in my stomach that's like, oh my gosh, did someone just say that? And you feel very shocked and you think, did I hear that right? So often we don't address microaggressions, and often we don't know what to say to address macro level racism either. The thing I want to get across, and in a loving way, is everything speaks, including our silence. And so sometimes if we don't speak, even saying something imperfect or stepping out there or having a conversation after a meeting or whatever else about something that made us uncomfortable, it may actually breed more silence or even incivility. I always have students, I can never forget this. I have students who have told me, you know, when we start a class in a new semester, if a student throws a microaggression and if the professor stays totally silent, then that student goes, now I know anything goes in here. That professor's not going to try to stand up with or for me. Oh no. And so sometimes our silence can actually breed an environment or a more hostile environment for our colleagues, our community members, our students, or our folks in our spiritual community, without us intending that. And this gets back to what Christy was talking about, intention. There's so many times we don't intend something to be in a bad way, and it still has an impact. So I'm going to ask us to really try and raise our awareness on that. I want to just use a word called ally. Allies, you may have heard this, sometimes it's a contested word, but here's what I mean when I say allies. How can any of us could be an ally at any time, because someone might be targeted who is in a category that we're not in. So it might be around race, it might be around gender, it might be around sexuality, it might be around a different religious faith or non-faith, it might be around age, ability, any of these number of things. And so an ally commits themselves to ending the systemic oppression. This is a person who wants to try and transform something like systemic racism for our cases. And an ally follows the lead of targets, and then acts accordingly. So what it means is, because I'm a white woman doing this work, I have to very clearly stand in dialogue and solidarity with, and be ready for feedback that maybe I go, ooh, I'm an educator on these things. Ouch, that hurts a little. I need to be really open to, wow, I may not 100% of the time be a great ally. I need to be following the lead of those who are targeted by systemic racism, and I need to act accordingly and act in solidarity with them. Two little terms I want to add. I don't know if many of you have heard the term white savior. There's a thing about when a lot of folks become more aware of racism and they go, I want to use my white privilege. I get it. Like, I hold privilege. I want to do this. And so what we want to avoid is being a white savior, being the person that's like, I'll save everyone. Let me reach down. Instead of reaching down in this hierarchical way, as I think I know better, I'm coming in. You'll want to stand in solidarity, or that's my frame. I want to stand in solidarity with folks and go, how can I be an ally? How can I listen deeply? Follow the lead of those who are targeted by this system of oppression, systemic racism in this case, and how can I act accordingly in concert? I've many times asked a friend, how can I stand with you? And they will give me a really specific, I need you to say what you said to me. I need you to say that to this person. That letter you sent to me privately, I need to ask you if you would actually be willing to say it to the person in power who actually holds the opportunity to change these outcomes. A performative ally is something, now I just moved from the Bay Area. Performative ally happens less in Louisville, I think, but this is someone who, this can happen, I think, in a number of places. This person who's like, I'm an ally, you need to know that I'm an ally. And you kind of go, well, I'd like to see your behaviors in that way. That's how you can tell an ally instead of someone proclaiming it. So just want to encourage us to think about deep allyship. Now, the next slide is the piece about anti-racism. Honestly, I think that this is a fantastic clip. I think it is really, really helpful about what it means to, instead of just saying, I'm not racist, to moving into anti-racism. So
we'll just call it spade a spade. Saying I'm not a racist and being anti-racist is like two different things.
When most people think of racism, they think of, let's say what happened to George Floyd, or they think of the KKK, or they think of slavery. And when that is kind of your perception, it's very easy to say, well, I would never do that. I would never do that awful thing, which is valid, but it's more nuanced than that.
Someone saying like, I'm not a racist doesn't help the problem. Simply saying, I'm not doing that does not save somebody's life. It's like witnessing someone getting jumped and being like, hey, I didn't jump him. It's like, but you also just stood there while he or she got jumped. And being an anti-racist is like, one, getting involved and being like, break it up, stop this. And two, speaking out to make sure it never happens again.
I would say on a very basic level, it's just about passive and active language, right? To say one is not racist doesn't actually connote any action. If you think about, let's pick baseball. To be not racist is going for a bunt. You hold the bat out, the ball, you hope the ball hits the bat. You're not expecting to hit the ball hard. You just want to get the ball to connect with the bat so that you can attempt to make a play. To be anti-racist is to swing the bat as hard as you can and go for the home run. To put in the extra effort to shoot for the stars and to actually swing that bat, right? To risk the strike, right? But you swing the bat as hard as you can every single time, right? Because you understand that that's the way you win games. That's the way you change things.
One of the most freeing things that white people can do, or actually any human being on the planet could do right now, is to just say, of course I'm racist. Of course I'm racist. If you grew up in a house that spoke French and you, as a baby, just started laying in your crib, listening to people speak French over you, you wouldn't have to do anything to start gaining proficiency in the French language. You would just speak it because that's what's being spoken around you. Our society speaks racism. It has spoken racism since we were born. Of course you are racist. Of course. The idea that somehow this blanket of ideas has fallen on everyone's head except for yours is magical thinking. It's useless.
Look, I think we celebrate the best of us, but I also think we had to live self-examined lives to mine and excavate the worst of us in order for there to actually be a good world, right? And I think that's what everyone's afraid to do.
The best way to get over stuff is to talk about it. This stuff will never change until people become comfortable having these uncomfortable conversations on both sides. Both sides. I mean, they're not comfortable conversations. I mean, I've had to have conversations with people in my family, and I'm in an interracial relationship, and having the conversation is not the easiest thing to do, but you have to do it.
It's really easy to kind of unintentionally create an echo chamber. A lot of us are friends with people who look like us and who have the same beliefs as us. But having these conversations, especially, if you do have family members who harbor these like really, really toxic beliefs about Black people, rather than you talking about it with your fellow woke white friends, go talk to that relative.
That's the difference between non-racist and anti-racist. Anti-racist is about action. That to do nothing is to leave the system firmly in place. It is to absolutely affirm the status quo of certain bodies being allowed resource access opportunities and other bodies being literally killed. So if you want to assure that racism stands, continue being non-racist. But if you would like to see racism dissolve, if you would like to see the interruption of racism, the interruption of white supremacy, then what you'll do is say, where do I speak French? And how do I translate that to a language that is less harmful? I think we all have the opportunity to do that right now.
To my allies out there, I'd say first and foremost, listen to your brothers and sisters who are Black, and then listen to yourself. Tap into you. Who are you? And be honest about your biases. Be honest about how you really feel when I come around. How would you really feel if your daughter brought home meat, or your son? Or how many times you heard your parents say something racist and you let it slide because you figured it wasn't worth having the conversation. Like these are the things, right? Or how many times you watched a television show and you laughed at something that you knew was actually not funny at all and could be harmful for other people in this world.
I want you to see it. I want you to actually feel it and understand that it's wrong versus just knowing that it's wrong. Because I can know so many things are wrong and still engage in wrong activity. But until I feel that it's like wrong, and until it like bothers me to do these things, then I won't really be an effective participant in this.
I think there are a lot of people right now in this moment that are awakened in a new way. They're like, oh, I see some things that I just never saw before. Wow, it's like the great white wokeness. And it's not enough to just be awake. We wake up every morning, and if you just sat in your bed once you were awake, nothing would get done. So when you wake up, you do something. Tiny things. I say, if you really are a person who's like, I believe everyone is equal. I believe everyone is equal. Is your bookshelf equal? Are the restaurants that you go to equal? Are the physicians and the professionals that you hire in your life, are they equal? Is your social media feed equal? Because yes, the more expansive your world is, the more people you start to think about. When someone says humans, you see an array of humans, not just white humans. And that is how we start to change things. Because if I can think about you on a conscious level, then your life really does matter. I will make sure that it actually matters.
To me, as I was someone who certainly as a white woman had to take a full journey into realizing how much I didn't know. The moment of my awakening, I had to realize how much I didn't know, how much my friends and family members and community members and fellow students of color were experiencing that I was frankly oblivious to, that I was meant to not know about, again, back to white privilege, and that hearing about things like anti-racism, what is it and how is it different from not being racist? I really wanted to share that with you all. I also want to say there are so many ways in which learning about these things, and again, I assume folks are very different parts in the journey, learning about how deeply racism pervades our society, our institutions, our religious institutions, our spiritual circles, our city governments, and our all of the above, our institutions, can be really painful. And I want to ask you all to push through. A friend wrote a post on Facebook the other day saying, push through like you're birthing. You don't in the middle of a birth because it hurts. You don't stop. You push through and you turn that energy into powerful energy for anti-racism. I know that some of you are already there, others may be at different parts of the journey. So I want to say, keep moving through and find folks that you can have continued dialogues with.